Alright guys and girls, welcome back to more SOVL PvP with actually a little bit of PvE in here today as well, because we're kicking off our long-awaited guide to SOVL's DLC. I'm hoping that these videos are going to serve as both like a buying guide if you're not sure what to pick up next, but even for new and returning players, this should give you an idea of how to tackle these armies when you go up against them on the PvP ladder. There's going to be a separate video for each of the 6 DLC factions, then I'll probably cover off the supporters pack as well in the last one. And for each of these, we're going to be talking about what makes the army unique, both for PvP and the campaign mode, some notable units, the particular strengths and weaknesses of the army, advice of playing against them, going to share some example PvP lists, and finally we're going to cap it all off by answering the question, why should you play this army? So with that said, let's get started with probably one of my favorite factions, and that's so the pagan bestial mutants from the Mark of Beasts DLC, the Goatmen Raiders, aka Beastmen, Brayherd, Beasts of Chaos. They're one of the most aggressive factions in the game that really like to get into melee and just smash face. While some other factions have units with the ambush ability, which allows you to deploy further up the battlefield, Goatmen have by far the most, which really lends itself to this aggressive swarming playstyle where you just want to get into the flanks and pressure your opponent. In the campaign mode, the goats have access to demonic gifts, which is a unique unit upgrade that gives the unit +1 to a random stat. So this really adds another element of randomness to unit progression, but can be really powerful if you spike and hit something like +1 attacks or +1 wounds on the right unit. In terms of notable units, I think 2 of their wild beast options in the Minotaurs and the Feral Giant are amongst some of the best units in the game. They have really great damage output and survivability for their cost. Alongside them, you'll see very few Goatmen lists without some number of either raiding chariots and or feral hounds, as these kind of fast, cheap mobile units really exemplify that aggressive swarming playstyle. Ambush on the raiding chariot in particular, I think really puts it a cut above the other chariots in the game, because it just doubles down on what chariots want to do anyway, which is dive down the flanks or get up into your opponent's face. I think all 3 of the Goatman's commander options are viable for PvP. Warcry on the Longhorn makes it a really great force multiplier. The Shaman's access to Hex of Ruin, which I think is still by far the most impactful spell in the game, can really elevate some of Goatman's otherwise lackluster shooting. And then the Minotaur Lord is just an absolute wrecking ball in combat. I think one of the Goatman's biggest strengths is their speed, because in addition to things like the hounds and the chariots, the high number of ambushing units that we mentioned not only means that they're able to get into combat quickly against opponents that would rather sit back, but it also allows them to kind of outposition their opponent with lots of cheap units. They also have a fairly good variety of builds, which really makes them, personally, my most played faction in the game. In terms of weaknesses, running multiple cheap units means that yes, you can set up that kind of flee and counter game, but they have a relatively low discipline across the board, making that a somewhat risky prospect, because your unit can just keep running completely off the board. They also don't have much in terms of defensive capabilities, so they can struggle against armies that can sort of absorb or ignore that initial offensive punch. And then here I was initially going to talk about their kind of mediocre shooting, but then Kenji went and performed really well in a recent Discord Cup with an all-shooty goat list. So I do think with only skill 3 power 3 bows for the most part on the skirmishers, they do really rely on Hex though to be effective. So like most lists that want to swarm their opponent, the numerous cheap units are often outclassed in a one-on-one fight. So protecting those flanks by using terrain and forming sort of solid defensive lines can force them to take frontal charges where they'll be much less effective. As I mentioned, Minotaurs, Chariots, Feral Giants are all amongst some of their strongest units, and all of them are vulnerable to the Lethal Shots ability, which deals double damage against multi-wound targets. And with defense 3 and only 1 wound each, even otherwise kind of lackluster or incidental sort of shooting can really do a number against those feral hounds. As I mentioned, Goatmen have a pretty good variety of viable builds for PvP. This first one I'm going to show you is actually the list I featured in only my second video on the channel, way back in the SOVL Showdown tournament, and it still holds up. It's kind of centered around the Shaman with Hex of Ruin, paired with a couple of units of skirmishers and the boulder throw on the Feral Giant, meaning that you can often pop that Hex of Ruin and shoot off a really high value target even as early as turn 1. Haven't really mentioned them yet, but the skirmishers are a nice little unit where, yes, they have short bows. It is only skill 3, power 3, range 20. But I think how I like to think about this unit is with ambusher and hand weapons, so they're actually a really good melee unit. I kind of think of them as a melee unit with a shooting option rather than the other way around. Paired with that is another ambushing unit in the Mongol pack here, and the raiding chariot, just to kind of be that speedy unit to get into those flanks. Pretty well-rounded list. One downside to this list, or I suppose one improvement, could be trying to add a 6th unit in, because as we know, having more units than your opponent really helps when it comes to getting those flank charges and intercepts. In order to achieve that, you could drop some of the additional skirmishers here. Let's see. And then maybe take out the boulder throw to add something like a unit of hounds. Be pretty much perfect. So yeah, but that would come at the cost of a little bit of your ranged output. Next, let's talk about a few options if you want to run double Minotaurs, one unit as the retinue for the Minotaur Lord and another as the Wild Beasts option. First of all, I do think that running 2 units of 3 is enough. You can bump them up to 4, but that really limits your points for the kind of supporting units, and really 3 in a unit with their 2-hand weapons and frenzy are really enough to do the job. This is the version of the list I've played with most, and actually I talked about this more in the video where I was deciding what list to take for the first SOVL Discord Cup, so you can go check that out. I do like the double raiding chariot for the reasons I mentioned there, where you can put them right in your opponent's face on turn 1 and forcing them to take a charge, and if you counter and you're at the side, it will spin that unit, and then you can follow with the Minotaurs and get an easy flank. However, that is only good against certain lists. This can also be a bit vulnerable. I think someone pointed out that there's nothing really good, or you don't really want to go against your opponent's hounds or wolves, which are fairly common amongst a few different armies. With anything here, a slight different variation you could have here if you wanted to upgrade the Goatman into a unit of Mongol pack with that ambush ability. You can drop one of the raiding chariots instead for another unit of hounds and take the vitality off the Minotaur Lord here for exactly 500 points. Another slight variation you could go with, if you wanted just a little bit of shooting, is drop another unit of hounds, 4 unit skirmishers, and yeah, you need the Goatman as the battle line again, 500 points. That gives you a little bit of shooting against things like hounds. Either way, I think running 2 units of Minotaurs can be really strong. They do need to get into combat to do their damage, so can struggle against things like elves that can like kind of flee and then shoot them off. And finally, let's take a look at the somewhat meme but fun list of the 5 chariots. This is another list that I've done a video on, so go check that out. Yes, it is a bit of a meme, but it can be surprisingly strong. There are certain lists that this is incredibly oppressive and strong against just being able to swarm your opponent. Likewise, there are other lists though that has a really unfavorable matchup. But yeah, go check that other video out if you want to see a bit of a quirky list here. So that brings us to the question, why should you play Goatmen Raiders? I feel like you should play them if, you were the kid who went into your garden and dug up your dead cat. If your idea of a good time is, heading down to the woods for a relaxing walk and maybe like a pagan blood sacrifice. And if in game you just want a fast but flexible force that really wants to get into the face of your opponent and smash face. And I think that about sums it up for this video. If you want an even more melee focused face smashy army, stay tuned for the next one where we'll be taking a look at. But until then, subscribing, commenting, etc., doing all that stuff for the YouTube algorithms really helps small channels like this. Check out the links below to the Discord server and other SOVL PvP content creators. And until next time, bye bye.